You are a priest in the year 1396, standing within the cold, stone halls of Westminster Abbey. Your breath fogs in the crisp autumn air as you clutch your prayer book, watching with quiet curiosity as servants rush about, preparing for what the courtiers whisper will be the most unusual royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has arrived from France. A princess, they say, the daughter of King Charles himself. You've blessed many unions over the years, joined countless hands in holy matrimony, yet never before have you witnessed such a stir at court. When the grand oak doors swing open and the wedding procession enters, your eyes widen in disbelief. The groom is none other than King Richard II, standing tall and regal at 29 years old. His golden hair catches the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting a glow around his stately figure. But beside him walks what appears to be a mere child, barely reaching his elbow. Her tiny hand disappears into his gloved one. She cannot be more than 6 or 7 years old, this little princess in her intricate French gown. Her dark hair is braided with pearls that seem far too heavy for her small head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, England's new queen. In your lifetime, you've seen brides as young as 12 or 13. Political marriages are the norm among noble families. You understand the times you live in. Life is brief, uncertain. The Black Death swept through only 50 years ago, taking half the population. Kings must forge alliances while they can, and marriage seals a treaty more firmly than any scroll or royal seal. As the ceremony begins, you watch the child's face. She seems more curious than frightened, her large, dark eyes absorbing the splendor of the moment. The soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candlelight, the nobles adorned in silk and velvet. When King Richard speaks his vows, his voice is soft, almost protective. This is no monster exploiting a child for selfish desire. This is a king performing his duty, securing peace with France through one of the most sacred bonds. The marriage will not be consummated. All understand this. The little queen will be raised and educated at the English court until she comes of age. This is the way of things. You pronounce the blessing with a steady voice, though your heart beats oddly as you declare them husband and wife. As this tiny girl is crowned Queen of England, you can't help but wonder what fate awaits her in the treacherous world of royal politics. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me that we're exploring these ancient tales together from across the world, connected through time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II was never meant to be a love story. It was a calculated act of medieval diplomacy. One small figure moved across the vast chessboard of Europe to help end one of its most devastating conflicts, the 100 Years' War. To understand Isabella's fate, we must first understand the world she was born into, and the forces that would shape her brief, tragic life. Isabella was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris, the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled kings. Her father, Charles VI of France, suffered from fits of madness that likely made for some terrifying moments during her childhood. History remembers him as Charles the Mad. His condition would at times transform him from a capable monarch into a man lost in delusion, forgetting his own identity, believing he was made of glass, or refusing to bathe for months. Imagine little Isabella, growing up in the lavish yet unstable French court. One day, her father might bounce her on his showering her with gifts and affection. The next, she might find him cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him, or standing completely still for hours, convinced that if he moved, his glass body would shatter into 1,000 pieces. During these terrifying episodes, palace servants would rush the children away. But the fear, the confusion, always lingered in young Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a formidable presence at court, a beautiful and intelligent woman trying to hold the kingdom together during her husband's frequent bouts of madness. She was politically astute and fully aware that her children were more than just heirs. They were valuable pieces on the chessboard of European power. She watched her eldest daughter with careful, calculating eyes, fully aware that Isabella's beauty and royal lineage could one day forge a powerful alliance for France. The world Isabella was born into was scarred by almost constant war. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in a brutal conflict, the 100 Years' War. It had begun as a dispute over the English claim to the French throne, but over time, it had evolved into something far more complex. A war for national identity, economic control, and territorial dominance. Entire generations have been consumed by it. French villages have been burned and looted during English raids. English nobles had spent their fortunes funding military campaigns across the Channel. By the 1390s, both kingdoms were exhausted. Their people were weary, their treasuries nearly empty. And in both courts, whispers of peace had begun to surface. But peace required more than words. It required bonds that couldn't easily be broken. And that's how 6-year-old Isabella found herself thrust onto the grand stage of European politics. The idea of marrying her to King Richard II first emerged during secret negotiations between English and French ambassadors in 1395. The English king had been mourning the death of his beloved wife, and of Bohemia, who had died of the plague the year before. And known lovingly by the people as Good Queen and had been adored for her gentleness and charity. Her loss left Richard not only heartbroken, but dangerously without an heir, an unstable situation for any medieval monarch. His advisors pressed him to remarry, but Richard resisted. His marriage, too, had been built on genuine affection, a rarity in royal unions. The idea of replacing her felt like a betrayal. But duty to the realm soon outweighed personal grief. When French ambassadors arrived with an astonishing offer, Richard began to listen. The proposal was bold, even audacious. France offered not only the hand of their king's eldest daughter, but also a staggering dowry of 800,000 francs, enough to refill England's depleted treasury. More importantly, they offered a 28-year truce. An entire generation could grow up without war. But there was one glaring problem. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even by medieval standards, that was exceptionally young. Most political brides were at least nearing adolescence. Still, the French negotiators insisted that her age was a strength, not a weakness. This marriage, they said, would be a clean slate, untainted by bloodshed and hatred. Raised in England, Isabella would learn the customs, the language, and the loyalties of her new home. By the time she came of age, she would be as English as she was French. Among Richard's counselors, opinions were divided. Some saw the wisdom in the match. The dowry alone could sustain the royal household for years, and a long truce would give England a chance to shift its focus, to address the growing threat from Scotland and ongoing unrest in Ireland. Hers worried about the precedent of marrying a child so young, fearing it would scandalize even the medieval nobility. But Richard himself was intrigued by something else entirely. Court observers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors, something in his expression softened. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless king saw in this arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father as well as a husband. The negotiations stretched on for months, with ambassadors crossing the Channel repeatedly to hammer out the intricate details. Every aspect of Isabella's future life was debated and written into the treaty. She would retain her French servants and ladies-in-waiting. She would be allowed to practice French customs and keep in contact with her family through letters. Most crucially, all parties agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity. This protection was stated explicitly in the agreement. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her fate was being decided in council chambers and written into documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases, and royal seamstresses started preparing a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she would marry a great king across the sea. But at 6, the idea was no more real to her than the fairy tales her nurses whispered to her at bedtime. The wedding ceremony took place not once, but twice, reflecting the diplomatic complexity of the union. Isabella was only 7 when she married Richard II at the English-controlled port of Calais on October 31st, 1396. This first ceremony was intimate, attended mostly by the negotiators and high-ranking nobles of both realms. Calais, being English territory on French soil, served as neutral ground for this historic moment. Standing in the great hall of Calais Castle, young Isabella must have been overwhelmed by the gravity of the occasion. She wore a gown made of cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she needed help simply to walk. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by the many noble eyes watching her. A year later, she was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. Allegedly, several people died in the crush of the crowd trying to catch a glimpse of the famous young bride. The English people had heard stories of their new child queen, and curiosity drew massive crowds to London for her coronation. The ceremony itself was a breathtaking display of royal pageantry, carefully orchestrated to assure both the English nobility and foreign onlookers that this extraordinary marriage had the full blessing of the crown. Isabella was carried through the streets of London in a litter adorned with English roses and French fleurs-de-lis, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown crafted specifically for her small head, and her long train was carried by English duchesses who had been handpicked to serve as her guardians and teachers. The crowds lining the streets called out blessings in English, words she was only just beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been taught. The coronation feast that followed lasted 3 full days. There was music, juggling, and lavish theatrical performances, all portraying the glorious future this union was meant to bring to both realms. Isabella sat at the high table beside King Richard, picking carefully at her food with the perfect manners her French tutors had instilled in her, while the assembled nobles raised their goblets in toast to the health of the child queen. Yet even amid all the celebration, seasoned courtiers were beginning to wonder just how long this peace would last. In the medieval world, no matter how finely negotiated, treaties were delicate things. And Richard II, though currently powerful, was not universally admired among his peers. Whispers of discontent echoed through the halls, particularly from those who felt the king relied too heavily on his chosen favorites, and who resented his eagerness to make peace with France when England's military position still held strength. For now, however, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard had her settled into private apartments within Westminster Palace, carefully staffed with a household that blended both French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, not only in language and refinement, but also in the complex expectations of English court life. She learned to curtsy in the English manner, to choose wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the polished accent of the royal court, rather than the tones of her French instructors. Richard himself took a personal interest in her growth and well-being. Chronicles from the time describe him visiting her rooms regularly, bringing gifts from every corner of his kingdom, exotic birds from Ireland, finely bound books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisans. He appeared to genuinely enjoy her presence, and she, in turn, began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a tender mix of formality and affection that came to define their unusual relationship. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. Medieval royal households were often filled with noble children, living and learning alongside the monarch's family. Isabella formed strong bonds, particularly with the daughters of Richard's loyal supporters, girls close to her own age who guided her through the quiet rules and shifting layers of noble society. Her dearest companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Though only 2 years older, Margaret seemed wise and worldly in Isabella's eyes. She taught Isabella English games, helped her decide which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted, and warned her, gently, about the political whispers which even children could not entirely avoid. The two girls spent countless hours in Isabella's private garden, practicing their needlework while Margaret explained the tangled genealogies of English noble families and the ancient rivalries that still lingered behind courtly smiles. Isabella, a fast learner, often offered fresh insights, her French perspective shedding new light on English politics. Why do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully? Isabella once asked. In France, there are factions and feuds, but here, it feels like everyone is waiting for something. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had always been marked by tension with the nobility. A major rebellion during his youth had left him deeply distrustful of those who once opposed him. And now, many great lords believed Richard placed too much trust in his favorites and ignored noble counsel on matters of war and governance. The king is powerful now, Margaret said, but in England, power must be shared. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace. But some see that peace as weakness, as if he prefers talking over conquering. Isabella took in these lessons with the gravity of a child beginning to grasp that her life was woven into a world much larger than herself. She started to observe court life with sharper eyes. How nobles fell silent when Richard entered a room. How conversations shifted when she approached. How even her French ladies-in-waiting chose their words carefully when speaking of politics. The years 1397 and 1398 passed peacefully. Isabella matured from a tiny girl into a confident young lady, fluent in English and increasingly aware of the complexities of court life. Richard continued to show her kind, fatherly attention, and she began to feel truly at home in England. The stone corridors of Westminster, once intimidating, became familiar paths she could walk without fear of getting lost. Her education expanded far beyond the usual accomplishments of music and embroidery. Richard insisted she become literate in both French and English, and appointed some of the kingdom's finest scholars as her tutors. She studied history, especially the chronicles of French and English kings, learning about the men and women who had shaped the world she now lived in. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, Master William, would roll out enormous parchments across the floor, showing her the territories of both kingdoms and explaining how geography had long influenced war and diplomacy. "Look here, Your Grace," he would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This small channel has been both a bridge and a barrier. Your marriage may finally make it just a bridge." Isabella would nod solemnly, already understanding that she was more than just a young girl learning to be queen. She was a living symbol of peace between two ancient rivals. But symbols, she would soon learn, were fragile things. The first signs of unrest came in early 1399. Something had shifted at court. Conversations quieted as she entered. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged anxious glances when they thought she wasn't watching. Even Margaret grew distracted, though she tried to keep up their usual games and lessons. Richard changed as well. His visits became rare, and when he did come, he seemed distracted, often gazing out the windows toward the Thames, as if searching for something or someone. The thoughtful gifts stopped coming, and Isabella began to worry she had done something wrong. But the truth was far more dangerous than any childhood mistake. Richard was facing the gravest crisis of his reign. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom he had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army. He claimed only to want his inheritance, but it was clear he wanted much more. Many nobles, tired of Richard's rule, began rallying to Henry's side. The stability that had made Isabella feel so safe was unraveling at frightening speed. She realized just how serious things were one morning when she awoke to find several of her English attendants gone without a word. Her French maids gave only vague, nervous explanations. That afternoon, she heard shouting from the courtyard. Peering from her window, she saw unfamiliar soldiers bearing foreign livery. That evening, Margaret burst into her chambers, pale and frightened. You must pack. Only what's necessary, she said in a hurried whisper. We're leaving Westminster tonight. Where are we going? Isabella asked, her heart pounding. To the Tower, Margaret replied. The king says it's for your safety. She didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. The Tower of London was both a palace and a prison. And in times like these, the line between the two could vanish entirely. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything Isabella had experienced before. Instead of the grand, ceremonial procession she was used to, she traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy. Armed men rode ahead and behind her litter, keeping watch. The curtains of her carriage were tightly drawn, but she could still hear the sounds of the city surrounding them. Not the usual bustle of daily life and trade, but something far more urgent and threatening. When they reached the Tower, Isabella was settled into apartments that were comfortable yet clearly designed to confine rather than simply accommodate her. The windows were barred, and guards stood vigil at every entrance. Her French ladies-in-waiting were permitted to stay by her side, but most of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since arriving in England, Isabella felt truly isolated. On her second day in the Tower, Richard came to visit her, and the change in him was startling. The confident, kind king she once knew was gone, replaced by a man who looked as though years had been added to his appearance in mere weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that unnerved Isabella, reminding her uncomfortably of her father's bouts of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had at their first meeting. "I'm afraid our situation has become difficult. There are those who question my right to rule, who seek to undo the peace we have forged with your father's kingdom." Now 9 years old and far more mature than she had been 3 years earlier, Isabella understood the weight of his words. "Are you still king?" she asked directly. Richard's smile was bitter. "For now, yes. But Henry Bolingbroke has gathered many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you, as I once did." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. For the first time, Richard spoke to Isabella not as a sheltered child, but as a political equal, someone who needed to grasp the harsh realities of her situation. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of England and the peace with France hung precariously in the balance. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, her composure remarkable for a child so young. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella could see the torment this uncertainty caused him. "Henry may use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may honor our marriage and continue to protect you. Much depends on whether he values peace with France above his own ambitions." This was Isabella's first real lesson in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics. Her value as a person came second to her value as a symbol and diplomatic asset. The love and care Richard had shown her, though genuine, could not shield her from the greater forces reshaping the English kingdom. The following weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the city's noises beyond the tower walls, but was cut off from reliable news. Her French ladies whispered among themselves in their native tongue, yet even they knew little beyond rumors and speculation. Then, one gray October morning, Isabella heard the sound she had dreaded most, the heavy footsteps of armed men approaching her chambers. When the doors opened, the familiar guards were gone. Instead, new men entered wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. Behind them came a tall, imposing man with the bearing of a soldier and the calculating eyes of a politician. This was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to meet the child who was both an opportunity and a problem for his new reign. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply, as she had been taught when meeting a king. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her poise, intelligence, and silently weighing how best to use her. "Your Grace," he said formally, still using her royal title, "I regret that circumstances have made it necessary to discuss your future under such conditions." "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, her trademark directness cutting through the formality. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne. Isabella understood enough about politics to know that abdicated likely meant Richard had been forced to relinquish the crown. She did not challenge the euphemism. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most for her immediate future. What becomes of me? Henry's answer would determine whether Isabella remained a queen or became merely a valuable prisoner. Her fate now depended on how the new king would choose to use the peace treaty with France, whether to uphold it or to risk war in pursuit of other political aims. That, Henry said, depends on many factors. Your father's response to recent events, the advice of my counselors, and perhaps most importantly, your own conduct in the coming months. With those words, 9-year-old Isabella entered the most dangerous chapter of her young life. The protective bubble of Richard's court was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in turmoil. She was no longer simply a child queen being groomed to fulfill her royal duties. She had become a political prisoner, her value now measured against the cost of war or peace. The weeks following Richard's deposition were a masterclass in survival for Isabella. Though confined to the tower, she was not yet officially imprisoned. She had to navigate the treacherous and shifting loyalties of a court still uncertain about how to deal with her. Some of Henry's supporters argued that she should be sent back to France immediately. This would reduce the expense of maintaining her household and signal to the world that England was ready to renegotiate the peace treaty from a position of strength. Others counseled caution. They pointed out that Isabella's presence in English custody gave England leverage in future negotiations with France. As long as she remained in England, her father would hesitate to take any action that might endanger her. This cautious faction argued that Isabella should be kept in comfort but under strict watch. Isabella herself played her part with remarkable skill for one so young. She was unfailingly polite to her new captors, careful never to offend or give the impression that she might be plotting against Henry's government. At the same time, she preserved the dignity befitting her rank, refusing to be treated as anything less than the queen she legally remained. Her French ladies-in-waiting were invaluable during this period. Unlike her English attendants, most of whom had been dismissed or fled, these women remained loyal to Isabella's interests rather than to any English faction. They helped her understand the subtle complexities of her situation and coached her on the delicate balance she needed to maintain. Remember, your chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducy, advised her, you are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law in your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he has not yet dared to dissolve your marriage or formally repudiate the treaty. As long as that remains true, you have value, and where there is value, there is hope. Yet this hope came with a terrible cost that Isabella was only beginning to grasp. Rumors about Richard's fate began to reach the tower. First came whispers that he had died in captivity at Pontefract Castle. Then came darker insinuations that his death was not natural, that Henry's supporters had orchestrated an accident to eliminate the former king. When Isabella finally received confirmation that Richard was dead, the news struck her with unexpected force. She had never loved Richard as a wife loves a husband. How could she, still a child? But he had been kind to her, protective, and the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France. His death was not only a personal loss, but also the severing of her last tangible connection to the life she had tried to build in England. The circumstances of Richard's death carried ominous implications for Isabella's own future. If Henry was willing to arrange the murder of an anointed king, what scruples might he have in disposing of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? These fears proved justified in early 1400, when Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as the rightful king of England and renounced any claim she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. From Henry's perspective, the proposed agreement was a diplomatic masterpiece. By leaving England voluntarily, Isabella would implicitly accept that her marriage to Richard had been dissolved by his deposition. This would free Henry from the obligations of the original peace treaty, while avoiding the political fallout of forcibly expelling a child queen. For Isabella, the choice was stark. She could accept exile and acknowledge that her 3 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse, risking indefinite imprisonment. At just 10 years old, she was being asked to decide not only her own future, but the future of relations between England and France for years to come. Her French advisors were divided. Some argued she should accept the terms and return to the safety of her father's court, where she could be properly cared for, and perhaps eventually remarried. Others insisted she should refuse, maintaining that she remained Richard's legitimate widow and England's rightful queen regardless of Henry's usurpation. Isabella wrestled with the decision for weeks. Part of her longed to return to France, to see her family again, and escape the uncertain atmosphere of Henry's court. Yet another part recognized that accepting Henry's terms would betray Richard's memory and abandon the peace he had died trying to protect. In the end, the decision was taken out of her hands by forces beyond her control. During one of his lucid periods, Charles VI sent word that he expected his daughter to return to France immediately. The message, delivered through diplomatic channels, made clear that any delay or continued negotiations over Isabella's status would be seen as an act of hostility by the French crown. Faced with the threat of renewed war with France, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The terms of her release were deliberately vague, allowing both sides to interpret her return as either voluntary or forced, depending on their political needs. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was a bittersweet experience for Isabella. She was leaving behind the only home she had known for 5 years, the apartments where she had learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she had played with Margaret Holland, and the great hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. Yet, at the same time, she was returning to a family in a country that had become foreign to her during her years in England. She now spoke French with a faint English accent, preferred English fashions over French styles, and had to relearn the intricate etiquette of her father's court. The little girl who had left Paris at age 6 was returning as an 11-year-old young woman, shaped by experiences that none of her French relatives could fully comprehend. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's worsening mental condition. Charles VI was in the midst of one of his worst episodes when Isabella arrived, convinced he was being pursued by invisible enemies and refusing to recognize his own family. When he finally emerged from his madness several weeks later, he appeared confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten she had been married to the English king. Her mother, Queen Isabel, was more welcoming but also more calculating. She immediately began considering how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella held a certain diplomatic status that could prove valuable in future negotiations. More immediately, her experience at the English court made her a valuable source of intelligence regarding English politics and military capabilities. Caught between these competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge, Isabella found herself torn. She was French by birth and had returned to French soil, but she had also been Queen of England and felt a lingering obligation to the country that had been her home. When her mother's advisors questioned her about English defenses or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding specifics that might be used to plan military campaigns. The months following her return to France became a period of adjustment and reflection. No longer a child, but not yet fully an adult, Isabella, at 11, had already endured more political upheaval and personal loss than most would face in a lifetime. Now, the question was what role she would play in the complex world of medieval European politics. Her status as a former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect for various European nobles, yet it also complicated potential matches. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance, while others seemed more interested in the political advantages marriage to her could bring, rather than in Isabella herself. For her part, Isabella had developed strong opinions about marriage based on her experiences with Richard. She had seen how political marriages could offer protection and stability, but she had also witnessed how quickly such arrangements could collapse when circumstances changed. Any future husband would need to understand that she was not merely a diplomatic asset, but a young woman with intelligence, preferences, and ambitions of her own. The French court of 1401 was a dangerous place for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. The ongoing war with England fueled intense anti-English sentiment among the nobility, and Isabella's years as Queen of England caused some courtiers to view her with suspicion. She had to be careful not to appear too sympathetic to English interests while not betraying the genuine affection she had felt for Richard and some of his supporters. At the same time, her father's mental instability meant the French government was effectively controlled by competing noble factions, each striving to advance their own interests. Isabella had to navigate these factional disputes while avoiding being used as a pawn by any one group. Her mother, Isabel, proved to be both protector and potential threat. The Queen of France genuinely cared for Isabella's welfare, but was also a shrewd political operator who saw her daughter's experiences and connections as valuable resources for the crown. Isabel's protection came with the expectation that Isabella would serve French interests, even when those conflicted with her personal preferences or moral convictions. In 1402, new complications arose when Isabella received word that Henry IV was facing serious rebellions in England. The Percy family, once his supporters, had turned against him, and uprisings had erupted in Wales and Scotland as well. Some at the French court argued this presented an opportunity to invade England and restore the rightful dynasty, perhaps with Isabella playing a symbolic role as the legitimizing widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella found herself horrified by these discussions. She had no desire to see England torn apart by civil war. Regardless of her feelings about Henry's rule, the English people she had known, her servants, tutors, childhood companions, were innocent of the political crimes committed by their rulers. The idea of French armies ravaging English villages in her name was deeply disturbing. When directly asked about potential military action against England, Isabella chose her words with care. She pointed out that any invasion would likely result in massive casualties on both sides. The English people might rally fiercely to defend their homeland, regardless of their feelings toward Henry. Success was far from guaranteed, given England's natural defenses and long-standing military traditions. Her reluctance to support anti-English action earned her criticism from French hawks, who accused her of divided loyalties. But Isabella's position found support among more moderate voices at court, who argued that peaceful relations with England served French interests better than renewed warfare. These political tensions came to a head in 1403, when Isabella was approached by representatives of Charles, Duke of Orleans, with a marriage proposal that would dramatically change her life once again. Charles, Duke of Orleans, was Isabella's cousin, the son of her father's brother, and one of the most powerful nobles in France. At 29, he was exactly the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella. But now, with Isabella approaching 14, the age gap seemed less significant. The proposed marriage was attractive from several perspectives. It would keep Isabella within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a diplomatic asset for some foreign power. It would also align her with one of the most cultured and sophisticated courts in Europe. The Duke of Orleans was known not only as a capable military commander, but also as a patron of the arts and literature. For Isabella personally, the match offered the prospect of a marriage based on mutual respect rather than pure political calculation. She had met her cousin several times during childhood, and he had always treated her with courtesy and kindness. More importantly, he was old enough and experienced enough to be a true partner rather than simply another guardian figure. The negotiations took place against a backdrop of continuing chaos in England and growing French confidence that Henry IV's reign might not survive its early challenges. If Henry fell, there was always the possibility Isabella might be recalled to England to legitimize a new regime. This potential complication made the timing of Isabella's remarriage crucial from the French perspective. Charles understood the delicate nature of the situation. He was not merely seeking a wife, but potentially allying himself with a woman who might one day play a significant role in English politics. This added a layer of complexity to their courtship unusual even by the standards of medieval noble marriages. When Isabella first met Charles to discuss the marriage seriously, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and intensely engaged with the world around him. He spoke to her not as a child to be protected, but as an equal whose opinions and experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he told her during one private conversation, "that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella of Valois, the remarkable young woman who survived the courts of 2 kingdoms and emerged with her dignity intact." Isabella found herself genuinely attracted to Charles in a way she had never experienced before. At 14, she was no longer a child. The feelings stirring within her were those of a young woman discovering her own desires and preferences. Charles was handsome, cultured, and intelligent. But more importantly, he seemed to see her as an individual rather than merely a political asset. Once both parties agreed to the basic terms, the marriage negotiations proceeded swiftly. Isabella would bring her status as a former queen and her valuable political connections. Charles would provide her with a secure position in French society and protection from those who might seek to use her for their own purposes. The wedding took place in June 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a ceremony designed to contrast sharply with Isabella's first marriage, which had been a small, diplomatic affair. This celebration was a grand spectacle, meant to demonstrate the power and prosperity of the French royal house. Isabella, now 16, wore a gown of deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis. Her dark hair was crowned with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She walked down the aisle of the great cathedral with confidence, not as the frightened child who had been married to a stranger, but as a young woman choosing her own path. Charles waited for her at the altar in his finest robes, his face showing genuine happiness rather than mere diplomatic satisfaction. When Isabella and Charles exchanged their vows, their voices were clear and strong. Observers noted that they looked directly at each other, rather than simply reciting words out of political obligation. The wedding feast that followed was a grand celebration of French culture and power. Troubadours sang ballads honoring the couple, and elaborate theatrical performances depicted the triumph of love over adversity. The finest wines from across the realm flowed freely. For the first time, Isabella found herself relaxing and truly enjoying the festivities, something she had never experienced during her time in England. More importantly, she felt, for the first time since leaving France as a child, that she truly belonged somewhere. The French court had accepted her back, not as a failed political experiment, but as a valuable member of the royal family, one who had gained wisdom and experience from her trials. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles were among the happiest of her life. Charles proved to be not only a devoted husband, but also an intellectual companion who shared her interests in literature, music, and the arts. His court at Blois became a center of cultural refinement, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Isabella threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm. She patronized troubadours, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, established a scriptorium where monks copied and preserved important texts, and maintained correspondence with scholars throughout Europe. Her experiences in England had given her a unique perspective on European culture, which she used to foster intellectual exchange between French and foreign courts. She also began developing her own political voice. Charles valued her insights into English affairs, but more importantly, he respected her judgment on a wide range of issues affecting their duchy and the kingdom as a whole. Isabella found herself becoming a true partner in governance, not merely a decorative consort. In 1407, the couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Jean. Isabella approached motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Determined to be a more present parent than her own mother had been during the chaos of her father's reign, she insisted on nursing the baby herself, despite protests from court physicians who considered it beneath the dignity of a duchess. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella felt a profound sense of completion. This child would grow up knowing her parents' love and protection, free from the political machinations that had shaped Isabella's own childhood. She whispered promises to the sleeping infant in both French and English, vowing that Jean would have choices Isabella herself had never been given. The birth of their daughter deepened the bond between Isabella and Charles. He proved to be a devoted father, spending time with Jean despite the demands of his political and military responsibilities. Isabella often found him in the nursery, reading to their daughter or simply watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle of this new life they had created together. Yet even as Isabella enjoyed domestic happiness, the wider world continued to intrude. News from England remained troubling, with Henry IV facing rebellions and challenges to his authority. More immediately threatening, tensions within France were growing as the king's mental illness created a power vacuum eager to be filled by rival noble factions. Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was among the most ambitious. As the king's brother, he claimed the right to govern during Charles VI's periods of incapacity. But this claim was fiercely disputed by the Duke of Burgundy, who had his own supporters and vision for France's future. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions would eventually tear France apart. In the early years of Isabella's marriage, however, this seemed just another political dispute swirling around the royal court. Isabella tried to remain above the factional conflicts, focusing on her family and cultural pursuits while leaving the political maneuvering to others. This comfortable neutrality became impossible in November 1407, when Louis of Orleans was assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents of the Duke of Burgundy. The murder was carried out with shocking boldness, striking down the king's brother in broad daylight before the killers vanished into the maze of Paris's medieval streets. The assassination transformed Isabella's life overnight. Charles, who inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, was now one of the most powerful men in France, but also a marked man. The Duke of Burgundy had shown his willingness to use violence against his enemies, and the Orleans family had become his primary target. Isabella found herself thrust into a world of bodyguards and constant vigilance. Her movements were restricted for security reasons, and her correspondence was monitored to prevent any information about her family's activities from falling into enemy hands. The carefree atmosphere of their court at Blois was replaced by the grim reality of civil war. Charles himself was changed by his father's murder. The cultured, artistic young man Isabella had married now showed a harder edge, driven by a desire for vengeance that sometimes frightened her. Charles began gathering allies and resources for what everyone knew would be a long and bloody conflict with the Burgundian faction. Isabella supported her husband's cause, but worried deeply about the cost of the coming war. Having already witnessed the destructive power of political violence, she feared that France might suffer the same fate that had torn England apart during the Wars of the Roses. Her fears soon proved prophetic as the rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions escalated into open warfare. Amidst this turmoil, the birth of Isabella's second child, a son named Charles in 1408, offered a brief respite from the tensions. The arrival of a male heir strengthened the Orleans' claim to eventual leadership of France, but it also made Isabella's family an even more attractive target for their enemies. Isabella approached her son's upbringing with even greater care than she had shown with Jean. She was determined that Charles would understand both the privileges and the heavy responsibilities of his noble birth. But more than that, she wanted him to develop the character necessary to navigate the treacherous world of medieval politics without losing his humanity. Insisting on involvement in every aspect of his education, Isabella carefully selected tutors and designed his curriculum. Drawing on her own experiences at the English court, she ensured Charles learned multiple languages, studied the histories of European kingdoms, and developed diplomatic skills essential for his future role. As the early years of the Civil War unfolded, marked by battles and sieges that slowly drained both sides, Isabella found herself managing the family's territories while Charles was away campaigning. This responsibility forced her to master the complexities of medieval warfare logistics and governance. Surprisingly adept, Isabella used her diplomatic talents to maintain alliances and her organizational skills to ensure that supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's forces when they were needed most. Letters from this period reveal a woman transformed. No longer the confused child shuffled between courts, but a mature leader taking control of her destiny. The war devastated France. Entire regions were laid waste by competing armies. Trade routes were disrupted, and the common people suffered from the depredations of soldiers on both sides. Isabella used her position to provide relief wherever she could, founding charitable institutions and negotiating safe passage for refugees fleeing the worst fighting. Her efforts to aid the victims of war enhanced her reputation throughout France. She became known not just as the Duchess of Orleans, but as a compassionate leader who remembered her obligations to the common people. This reputation would prove invaluable in the years to come, as France's political situation grew even more complicated. The birth of Isabella's third child, a daughter named Margarita in 1409, brought both joy and anxiety. At 20 years old, the repeated pregnancies were beginning to take a toll on Isabella's health. Medieval medicine offered little understanding of maternal risks, but Isabella's intelligence allowed her to recognize the dangers she faced with each childbirth. She approached this pregnancy with particular care, following the advice of the best physicians available and preparing detailed instructions for the care of her children should anything happen to her. These precautions proved prescient, as complications during Margarita's birth nearly cost Isabella her life. For several harrowing days afterward, she hovered between life and death, weakened by blood loss and infection. Charles rarely left Isabella's bedside as messengers were sent across Europe, carrying pleas for prayers for her recovery. The possibility of her death forced both of them to confront the fragility of their happiness and the uncertain future awaiting their children. Isabella's recovery was slow and incomplete. The complications from childbirth left her weakened, her health permanently damaged. She became vulnerable to the many illnesses that plagued medieval populations. Most urgently, her physicians warned that another pregnancy could be fatal, an admonition that profoundly altered her relationship with Charles. Their physical intimacy grew cautious and constrained, overshadowed by the constant fear of conception. This change was particularly difficult for Isabella, who had once found great joy in the physical expression of their love. The passionate young woman who had recently discovered her own desires was now forced to suppress them for the sake of survival. Despite these challenges, their marriage remained strong. They found new ways to express love and partnership, focusing on shared interests in culture and politics. Isabella grew ever more involved in governing their territories, effectively serving as Charles's co-ruler while he campaigned against the Burgundians. In 1410, new complications arose when the Duke of Burgundy began secret negotiations with the English, hoping to bring Henry IV into the French Civil War on the Burgundian side. The prospect of English intervention horrified Isabella, who feared a return to the devastation of the 100 Years' War. Using her unique position as a former Queen of England, Isabella opened back-channel communications with the English court. Through intermediaries, she sought to persuade Henry IV that intervention would be costly and ultimately futile. Though hampered by lingering English suspicions toward her, she persisted, determined to prevent renewed large-scale warfare between the two kingdoms. These diplomatic efforts revealed Isabella's growing sophistication as a political operator. She understood that her value lay not only in her royal connections, but in her ability to discern the larger patterns of European politics and to craft strategies serving multiple interests simultaneously. Her success in diplomacy enhanced her reputation both in France and abroad. She was increasingly consulted not only on matters affecting her husband's domains, but on broader French policy issues. Her opinions carried weight, grounded in her unique experience and proven political acumen. Isabella's health, however, continued to deteriorate through 1411 and 1412. The damage sustained during Margarita's birth left her prone to respiratory infections and chronic fatigue, making daily life a struggle. She began spending more time in contemplation and prayer, perhaps sensing that her time was limited. Still, her mind remained sharp and her spirit engaged. She continued overseeing her children's education, managing political affairs, and pursuing cultural interests. Her determination to live fully despite her frailty inspired those around her. The spring of 1409 brought a brief glimmer of hope with preliminary peace talks between the Orleans and Burgundian factions. Isabella played a significant role in these negotiations, using her diplomatic skills and reputation for fairness to bridge the divide. Though the talks ultimately failed, Isabella's efforts earned widespread praise and bolstered her standing as a potential mediator in future conflicts. Her ability to work with representatives from both sides demonstrated her political maturity and commitment to peace. As 1409 wore on, Isabella's health declined more sharply. Chronic respiratory problems worsened, and she began suffering from the wasting disease that would eventually claim her life. Medieval physicians lacked the knowledge to identify tuberculosis, but they recognized her condition was grave. Facing death with courage, Isabella made careful arrangements for her children's futures, ensuring their protection and education regardless of what might come. She also worked to secure her husband's political position, aware that her passing might embolden their enemies. Her final months were filled with preparations for death and cherishing time with her family. She insisted on maintaining daily routines as long as possible, refusing to be a burden. Her bravery in the face of terminal illness became legendary, an inspiration recounted in stories and songs for generations. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1409, at the young age of 20. Her life had spanned 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, marked by the heights of royal power and the depths of political uncertainty. Her death was mourned across Europe, not only by family and subjects, but by all who had been touched by her kindness and wisdom. The funeral cortege that carried Isabella's body to its final resting place at the Celestine Convent in Paris was among the largest ever seen in medieval France. The political consequences of Isabella's death were felt far beyond her family. Her absence removed a moderating influence from the Civil War, and the conflict between the Orleans and Burgundian factions grew even more bitter and destructive. The peace she had so tirelessly pursued remained elusive, and France would endure internal divisions for many years to come. Yet Isabella's legacy extended well beyond the immediate turmoil. She demonstrated that even in an era when women were expected to be passive political pawns, a determined individual could carve out space for independent action and moral leadership. Her life became a beacon for other women confronting similar challenges. Later generations of female rulers and political actors cited her courage and intelligence as an example of what was possible for women in public life. Modern historians have sometimes struggled to fully grasp Isabella's story. The marriage of a 6-year-old girl to a 29-year-old man jars contemporary sensibilities about childhood and consent, even when understood as political necessity. But judging Isabella's world by modern standards risks missing the profound humanity of her journey. Born into a system that treated royal children as diplomatic assets, she transcended those limitations to create a life of genuine meaning and accomplishment. Her marriages, regardless of their origins, became partnerships founded on mutual respect and affection. The violence and political instability that marked her era were not products of moral failing, but reflections of a world where personal security and political legitimacy were constantly contested. Isabella's ability to navigate these challenges while maintaining integrity and compassion speaks to the enduring human capacity for growth and moral courage. Her story reminds us that history is not only about armies, kingdoms, and grand movements, but about the individuals who lived through those events and shaped them with their choices. Isabella of Valois chose to be more than a victim of circumstance. In doing so, she created a legacy that transcends the political realities of her time. Looking back across centuries, we see in Isabella's life both the constraints and the possibilities that have always defined human existence. Though bounded by the expectations of her age and gender, she found ways to exercise agency and make meaningful contributions to the world around her. Her story is ultimately one of resilience, intelligence, and a refusal to accept that personal happiness and political responsibility are mutually exclusive. The medieval world that shaped Isabella of Valois was harsh and unforgiving in ways difficult for us to fully grasp. Life was fleeting, childhood a brief interlude, and political alliances often forged at the cost of human lives. Yet, within these severe constraints, individuals like Isabella found ways to create beauty, extend kindness, and forge relationships that gave meaning to their existence. Her legacy is not one of victimhood, but of triumph over circumstances that would have crushed a lesser spirit. Ultimately, Isabella's story reminds us that every era carries its own moral complexities, and that people of the past, despite the vast differences in their worlds, shared the same fundamental human needs for love, security, and purpose. To understand her life is to glimpse something essential about the human condition, that while we are all products of our time, we are also capable of rising above the limitations that time imposes. If you enjoyed this captivating story, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback means a lot to us.